Hello, folks. Welcome back to Weekend Watch Repair. My name's Adam. Today's project is a Tissot Visodate from 1955. I picked up this watch in trade from a gentleman. I actually traded a newer Tissot and I got this and a little bit of cash, and we did a few watch trades here and there. And I just thought this watch was kind of interesting. The dial on it's got a pretty heavy patina, which I thought was pretty cool. But as you can see here, this case, the case needs a little bit of work. And generally on this channel, I've tried to avoid plated cases because I didn't have what I needed in order to restore them properly. And I just kind of had this thing in my back pocket, figuring one day if I ever get into replating and whatnot, this watch would be a good candidate. And well, now we have it. And I was kind of forced into it because I was waiting on a few things for this watch. But we'll get into that. Checking the function here. This watch, it is running, if you want to call it that. I mean, that's it is running, but as you'll see here on the time grapher, we'll go ahead and put this thing on. It's not running well. What we have here, ladies and gentlemen, is what I believe is referred to as a snowstorm for obvious reasons. It's saying the rate is extremely high. It's not really going to give us much of anything else, and I don't even trust that rate. It's just not picking up a good signal off this watch. Just running really, really poorly. So I've heard that referred to as a snowstorm on a time grapher, and I think it's a pretty apt description. So this particular Visodate is a camping model. Camping models first came out in 1938, and Tissot described them as something that was more suited for rugged use, better water and dust resistance. At the time, they had stainless steel cases and screw-on case backs. Later, by the early 50s, they had been largely replaced by plated cases and snap-on case backs like this one you see here. And in their defense, that snap-on case back was on there tight. Still, I would assume this thing had pretty good water resistance and held up to that camping moniker pretty well. So taking a look inside here, this is a fully in-house made Tissot 28.5R-621 movement, designed fully in-house by Tissot. They made these from 1952 to 1962. Pretty solid movement as we get in here. It's kind of got a unique bidirectional winding system on the underside of the winding rotor of the oscillating weight. You'll see here, we'll put it on screen. It's got a set of gears, and depending upon which way that rotor spins, one of those two gears will turn the automatic works. And so that way, regardless of which direction that rotor spins, it'll wind in the same direction on the automatic winding works. So we need to go ahead and remove the movement from the case. The first thing we'll do is pull our crown and stem out. We'll just take a look at that stem under magnification here, and it's pretty dirty, but otherwise it looks like it's in decent shape. That crown is a signed crown, and what's really cool is the font on the crown and on the dial is this old school italicized Tissot font, which I guess is I'm assuming is somewhat sought after in my research. I didn't know that at the time when I picked up this watch. And then there's two case clamps holding this movement in. And these case clamps are actually blued steel, which is pretty neat. But we're going to go ahead and remove these two screws and get these two case clamps out of the way. And what I don't notice at the time, there's a steel movement ring kind of surrounding that really that's to provide tension against the clamps, and those clamps clamp into like a recess in the case. So the movement ring in and of itself doesn't really do a whole lot. It centers the movement in the case, but that's kind of about it. But now we pull that thing out and take a look at that dial. It's real pretty. I'm kind of 50-50, to be honest with you, on patina. There's some people who just absolutely love it, no matter how, how degraded it is. And there's that movement ring I realized right there. We'll go ahead and pull it out. They just love that patina. Sometimes I get it. Sometimes I don't. In this watch, I just liked it. I just thought it looked neat. I'm the same way about case restorations. There are some absolute purists out there that never restore case. Some of them restore every case. And for me, It's just a project by project basis, and it's just a personal w- feeling, and just whichever way I want to go. And on this particular watch, I thought I wanted to take a crack at it, so we will do that. Now that we got the hands removed, I'm going to go ahead and store those in a little protector case there. There are two dial feed screws attaching the dial to the movement, and I'm just going to double check and make sure there isn't a third screw on the side of this movement. Doesn't look like there is. So now we can go ahead and pull this dial off. Here it is inside that protective case. And I'll go ahead and put that several feet away from me, and I won't touch it again until we're ready to reassemble. So now we can begin disassembly of the front side of this movement. And, this particular watch, I don't know where you are in the world, but there's a saying, it probably doesn't come from here, but we use it a lot when it's applicable. And we throw the kitchen sink at this watch. This turned out to be way more of a project than I had originally anticipated. And as you see me begin to remove parts from the front side of this watch, from the dial side of this watch, and one point here, the date jumper spring, since we pulled the hands off at around midnight, the date was about to change over. So that date jumper spring is really right on the edge of a tooth on the date wheel. So it's under a bit more tension. I kind of noticed that as I was beginning to remove it, but that thing comes off. But yeah, this watch had some problems that I originally didn't anticipate. One of them, I saw that while I was rambling on doing function testing, was that I noticed when I was uh, adjusting the hand position, setting the time just to check function, that it was way too loose. There was basically zero resistance on the crown when I was setting the hands. And that's an indicator that generally your cannon pinion's too loose. So that's one thing we're going to have to check on this. And on this particular watch, there is several things that, we have an opportunity to do. Like in this video, as I kind of referenced it earlier, we're going to replate this case, which is something that I'm fairly new to. And I've been saving this watch again for the purposes of doing that, because it's something I wanted to get into. And one thing real quick, this screw holding that date jumper, just kind of take a mental note, that screw is going to come into play a little bit later. We'll get into that. But this particular watch taught me some lessons about, and really some reminders about inspection and things you should check for, and certain things that, I've apparently been taking for granted on a few watches in the past, and they come to bite me in this watch. We'll document all that. But this one provided an opportunity to do some work that some of the stuff I haven't done for a while, some of the stuff, and really a lot of it I haven't done on the channel. So I'm really excited to bring that to you. So there's the setting lever spring. And next up, we can do our yoke spring. And this yoke spring is pretty substantial, and it's kind of an odd shape. And this footage reminds me I need to go ahead and take a bit of sandpaper to the inside of my tweezers to roughen them up a bit, to make them grab a little bit better. Here comes the yoke. Pretty standard keyless works on this thing. Nothing too spectacularly different. We need to go ahead and pull this crown and stem out one more time. So I loosen the screw. And now we can go ahead and pull this stem out. And I know we've already shown it once, but we're going to show it again just for the sake of showing it again. But here we go. Here comes the winding pinion and our sliding clutch. Last part to come off of this side is going to be the setting lever itself. And for that, I'm going to go ahead and just flip this movement around. And if we unscrew this screw, that setting lever should just fall off. So there we go. It just fell out the bottom there, and we'll go ahead and throw that in the parts tray. Now the screw can come out. Sometimes those screws are captured by the bridge. This one is not, so that just lifted out. And I want to remove wine from this watch. And as you can see by that arrow, that is a click spring, and someone has really gone to town on that. That is a click for the automatic works. So just like the ratchet wheel has a click you can use to unwind it if there is no automatic works, you can technically unwind this watch by holding back both those clicks, and it would release tension, but I'm not really too concerned with that. We'll go ahead and pull this off. And this bridge plate is on there hard. And that's a something I have found that about all the plates on this watch, the locating pins on this one are super tight, which is a good thing, but it can make removal a bit hairy because those things are on there so tight. But we removed that, all the wheels kind of stuck to that thing. So there's that click, and I want to go ahead and get that removed first because it's got spring tension on it, and without that bridge on top of it, that thing would go flying. So we get that disassembled. Here's that little gear. That is the gear that the 2-gear assembly on the rotor actually engages with that thing to engage the system. Here's a reduction wheel. Well, that's actually the reduction wheel. Excuse me. And the other one was the transmission wheel. And there we go. Notice that there's no jewels in that plate. It's all bushings in that. But now we can go ahead and safely remove power from this watch. So I'm going to hold back the click spring and go ahead and just gently unwind this thing. And if we left our keyless works in, I can, instead of using my screwdriver on the ratchet wheel, I could just hold the crown between my fingers and do the same thing. But I like disassembling the front side of the watch first, generally. This is the ratchet wheel held on by one screw. I'm trying to be very kind of careful and gentle and not scratch anything and just double check these screws because this is a completely new movement to me. And I wasn't sure if all the screws were going to match between the plates. And this here's a really good example of this. So this screw on the click spring is actually got quite a deep shoulder on it. And so we're going to compare that to the other screw in the bridge plate here in a minute. With that out, we can remove the click. And then there's a spring recessed into the plate here. So I'm just going to pull it out like so. And our ratchet wheel is held on by 2 individual screws. And generally when you see this, that means that that center part of that ratchet wheel is stationary and the ratchet wheel gear actually turns around that. So those are not reverse threaded like you would see normally on if there's a single screw in that and a solid wheel without a center. Most of the time those will be reverse threaded. This one's not. Pretty effective system, comes apart quite easily. I'm going to go ahead and check the side shake on this barrel. And as you can see, we got more than we want. That's definitely more than we want. And that barrel's got other issues that I will learn the hard way later. A little foreshadowing. But now we got power removed from this watch. Now we can just go ahead and get this balance out of the way. Really nice machining on this movement, by the way. I got, hats off to Tissot and this was not what I had in mind originally. When you think of Tissot, great watch brand, and generally, I mean, they make Swiss made watches for, affordable. It's the price point for entry on a Swiss made watch with Tissot is just about unbeatable. But, and I haven't taken apart like modern Tissots, but I know most of their stuff's all under the ETA and all that. And I guess you could say that's in-house, but because it's all owned by Swatch, but this one was made by Tissot. And man, they did a great job. I was really impressed with the quality of this movement. But taking a look at these 2 screws, you can definitely see that one on the left with that shoulder. And that shoulder is for the click spring to rotate around. So I want to make sure I take mental note of that for reassembly. But with those out of the way, we can get this barrel bridge off. There we go. Now we can remove our barrel, and we will disassemble that shortly. Next up is the pallet fork. In order to do that, we got to remove the pallet fork bridge, held on by 2 screws on this watch. And I tried my best to show you between this pallet fork bridge and the center wheel bridge. Those were the two that were easily the most stubborn to remove, but it is nerve-wracking doing this because the pivots on that pallet fork are so small and delicate. And the last thing you want to do is to, I'll tell you, I ordered enough parts for this thing, and some of them weren't easy to find because I didn't want to spend the money on, because a donor movement can cost you, they're well above, $100, $200 at minimum, and it's a gamble. You don't even know what you're going to get when you buy that. This thing here looked to be in pretty decent shape, otherwise, and I was trying to avoid buying additional parts if necessary. So I really took my time to remove that plate. But thankfully, what we got it out, no damage done. Now we can remove the bridge. And this is a very unique shaped bridge. And you can see the post for that automatic winding works, or for the rotor, is actually attached to that bridge as a separate part. So we'll go ahead and remove that as well afterwards. But this thing here is held on by 3 screws. Here comes number 3. And I need to shorten the edit on these things because it's kind of awkward, but I'm trying to be thorough. This is probably, honestly, the most thorough video. My OCD was an absolute overdrive editing this thing. So if I have camera footage of it, it's probably in this video. There's quite a bit, but I'm trying to show every screw and everything, but I think it does get a bit redundant sometimes. We got that bridge loosened up. And there we go, trying to lift it straight off. Kind of unique shape on that thing. There we go. And the wheel train. Here's our 4th wheel. The extended pivot on it, and that is the pivot that the seconds hand physically attaches to. Here's our 3rd wheel. Just being very delicate as I'm pulling these out. And our escape wheel. Being super delicate with this one. And that one is kind of, you got to lift it up at kind of a weird angle. It's probably easier to remove it with that center wheel bridge removed. And that center wheel bridge, there's a cover plate on it that separates that bridge from the pivot on the underside where that center wheel rests, where the 4th wheel goes through. That plate separates between those two. Now we can remove these 2 screws holding this plate on. And this is absolutely one of the most stubborn bridges I have ever taken off a watch. As you'll see here, I just didn't want to put it in just to show me lifting it off because it really wouldn't be honest. So first try here, I'm just using some brass tweezers, trying to nudge it off, at the ends just to get a little bit of movement, and it doesn't want to budge, not even in the slightest. So, okay, fine. Let's get a screwdriver out. Being gentle not to scratch. Even with a screwdriver, this thing does not want to go. And I'm thinking, goodness, look at it. I mean, it moved a little bit. So now, okay, fine. I just want to lift straight up, completely straight up, and take a look at, even then, that makes me nervous. I want to make sure that I didn't actually bend the plate because that thing was so stubborn. Thankfully, I didn't, mind you. I'm pretty happy about that. But I mean, that thing was just ridiculous. Go ahead and pull this center wheel out. There we go. We'll do some close inspection on that. And one thing I did on here, I showed a lot more of the pre-cleaning and then the inspection on a lot of those wheels and stuff. There's some shots in the video soon that haven't been shown on the channel before, so I hope you enjoy that. We'll kind of get a close-up view of those wheels as well. Now we want to go ahead and remove this oscillating weight post. This is held on by 3 screws, and the reason I want to remove this is because the jewel for the 4th wheel is on the underside of this. And just to make sure I give a thorough cleaning to that jewel on both sides and make it easier to lubricate during assembly, we're going to go ahead and pull this plate off now. And it will just make life a bit easier. There we go. Now you can see the jewel for that 4th wheel. And now I get to show you one of my screw ups. So we're going to go ahead and disassemble the barrel. Pretty straightforward disassembly on this barrel. Uh, Nothing too special about it. Separating the lid. There we go. And right here is the last moment before things went terribly wrong. Right here. So take a look. I'll just let you watch. Boing. There it goes. And I spent the better part of an hour to hour and a half looking for that thing. And I actually gave up. And you can see here, I found it. I only found it after I went online and spent $20 buying a replacement barrel arbor. And the funny thing is that, it flew off. I heard it hit the backstop of the bench, couldn't find it everywhere. Checked on the ground, got out magnets, could not find it. And eventually I gave up. I went and bought a new barrel arbor. And then I come back to the bench and I sit back down. I'm like, okay, well, let's go ahead and just finish disassembling this thing. And I look down at my bench, and about 8 inches away from where I laid down the barrel was that arbor sitting on my bench, staring me right in the face. So, yeah. And I guess it probably took a few bounces during flight and, ended up right back on my bench. So this mainspring here, I can kind of feel, I read somewhere that, that mainspring, it felt kind of bumpy and all that. It felt worn out. So we're going to replace it. Under higher magnification, we're going to take a look at these wheels, and you can see that upper pivot on that escape wheel. That looks kind of worn. Yeah, here's the fourth wheel. That bottom pivot looks pretty good. The pinion on that thing is a bit dirty, but I'm also taking a look at a different view and checking all the teeth. Here is our center wheel. And that thing looks like it's been running dry on that post, but take a look at that pinion. Ooh, filthy. We're going to go ahead and take a look at the pallet fork as well. And you can kind of see that there is the exit stone, and you can see where that escape wheel has been riding in that stone. But I went ahead and try to remove a bunch of this grime and gunk before it even gets to cleaning, because sometimes just the fluids alone won't be enough to remove that caked on lubricant. So I'm using some Rodico, and I think that, well, this blue stuff, someone had mentioned that blue stuff is like a Rodico alternative. I'm just trying it out. But that is the entry stone. But after kind of going back and forth a few times, and the light hits it just right. That's kind of about how I like to get those pallets, stone faces. And lastly, here, I'm going to go ahead and take a look at this main plate with a backlight behind it. And what I find is it makes it a lot easier to inspect the condition of the jewels. If there are any cracks or chips, it makes it a lot easier to identify. The one issue, I'm trying to just film this whole thing, but my microscope camera does not have an autofocus. So when there's an elevation change in this plate that's significant enough, it'll go out of focus because the depth of field is so small, and I can't adjust aperture settings on that cheap camera, but you get the idea. But the first thing I like to do during the pre-cleaning process is peg all the jewels and use pegwood to basically break up any gunk or anything that's kind of formed, because in the wash, in the cleaning fluid and the chemical, it may not be enough to remove, it'll start to dissolve stuff, but it may not be enough to remove caked on stuff. So I try to loosen all that stuff up first here as when I can. And I'll do that to almost all the parts, and we'll take a look at the balanced jewels. This is another issue I had, but see this jewel here on the balance setting, it's got that ring machined around the edge of it. And my best guess, I've never seen that. My best guess is that's something for oil retention. That bottom jewel was, ooh, that thing was rough. And you may be asking yourself why I'm not going to show the other jewel. And the reason I'm not showing it is because in the process of going from the part tray to the microscope, I pinged it out of my tweezers, never to be found again. Issue number 2, that was completely my fault. So I had to source one of those. And in the end, it would have been easier to buy a donor movement, but I found the parts. So next stage in cleaning is I've got some naphtha. I'm going to take almost all the parts, with the exception of anything with shellac, so no balance assembly, no pallet fork. And I like to do this before we go into the cleaners. And I really haven't shown this on the channel much, but this is part of my pre-cleaning routine. You can kind of hear that blower. I just thought it sounded funny in high speed. And my TV going on in the background. I had The Godfather playing in the background, so there you go. I thought about keeping some of the audio in and just seeing if you could guess which Godfather movie it was just by a short audio clip. But then I'm like, no, that's obviously copyrighted, and I'd probably get in trouble for that, so I better not. And that's honestly, that's why I do a lot of the voiceover work, because sometimes you'd probably much rather hear what's going on in the background, but you know, I don't own that content, so I can't publish it. But we got that done. Just kind of cleaning all these parts up. And this is just, I'm just showing a couple of these stages, and I'll clean these kind of in batches of parts. That way I can keep everything organized, but I'll work through all of them. And now before it goes into the main cleaning, I want to go ahead and repair the barrel arbor. So we're going to go ahead and use a domed punch and a domed stake, getting into my staking tool here. And we're going to go ahead and lightly tap on this. We'll keep the audio in here, but here, just take a listen. And what we're doing through that process is trying to compress that metal down and shrink the size of that hole. And we shrink it further, smaller than what the barrel arbor will fit into. So now I'm using a smoothing broach, albeit, and I'll be the first to say it, technically from the wrong side. Those smoothing broaches are tapered, so if you broach it from the other side, it accentuates kind of an oil sink. And this is the first attempt, and clearly that's still way too tight. It's not even worth putting on the watch yet. So I'm going to loosen it up again. It does, by using those dome punches, it does kind of create a countersink as well. So it doesn't actually hurt a thing at all. But technically speaking, I should be doing this from the other way around. But that second one felt pretty good. Here's a close-up. You can see how much less side shake we have in that barrel assembly. So I'm pretty happy with that. I still had free movement. And we'll go ahead and give it a spin test here. And you know, this will come into play later, because the one single thing I didn't check on that is the one thing that's going to bite me in the rear end later. But we'll get into that. But with that done, now we can go ahead and put all these things into the cleaner. So this watch here, I'm keeping all the screws, and I don't do this on every watch, but I felt pretty comfortable with this thing. And I'm putting all the parts in groups where I know which screws go with which part in which section of each basket. So when it's a lot, I'll do those separately by hand, because I got a different system, but that allows me to keep everything organized. And now we can move on to our cleaning machine. This is my OMA machine. Very privileged and lucky to have it, to be quite honest. It's unnecessary for my skill level, but I'm glad I have it. But with that said, I really would like to take this opportunity, just again, say thank you to the patrons of this channel. Your support makes this entirely possible, especially on this video. It probably wouldn't have happened without your help. A special shout out to our newest members, our Jan, Brian, and Joe. I really appreciate it. If you're interested in supporting the channel, you can take a look at the link on screen. There's also info in the description of the video. So yeah, taking apart the case. That was my honest first attempt at it. You can see that that crystal was not held in there basically at all. It's amazing it didn't come off beforehand, but yeah. So while I'm waiting on the parts, a new mainspring, and stuff to arrive, I said, okay, fine. At this point, I had been waiting 2 weeks for a package to get released from US Customs. And I said, you know what? I'm done with it. I've been piecing together some plating stuff, but I'm going to go ahead and attempt it. So this is my window of opportunity to do it. So you can see the state of the case here. And the first thing we need to do is I need to remove the old plating. So I have a diamond file, and I'm basically, and it's going to make you cringe until you see the finished product. And it made me cringe just starting it, but I'm using very light pressure, just nearly the weight of the file only. And in an attempt just to see how this works and to remove this plating by hand. So you can kind of see the brass start to peek through a little bit, but I'm just gonna work it a little bit and see how this goes. And so I'm not gonna show obviously the entire process. I mean, this took hours upon hours upon hours. And I have a set of these diamond files. You can get them real cheap, and there's different shapes. And I found this one is a flat on one side and a kind of a conical shape on the other. And I found this really handy. And again, I'm going very light and trying to be as parallel as possible. And there we go. We'll kind of grind it, sand down one side and try to remove a lot of the plating. There we go. That's getting there. It's obviously very rough at this point, but this was just my attempt at it. There's probably a better way, and I thought about at one point finding a chemical solution, but I think it's at my skill level, which is basically nil right now. It's more trouble than it's worth. So here we go. That's just after the file, and now I'm going to go ahead and begin sanding just on this one side. So this is starting out. This is 320 grit sandpaper. And I'm just going to, again, just do this by hand at first and just see what we can make of this thing. So you can already see it smoothing out the rough spots. It's actually, and this is brass. Like, this is not stainless steel. This isn't terribly hard to work. So you do see results fairly quickly. But now you can see one half of that sand and one half of it's not, and that is the difference. So that, in my opinion, is not shabby. Yeah. So I'll go through and kind of work over both sides of that and just the edges at first, because I mean, frankly, these are the easiest ones to do. Here it is, fully sanded, just at 320. I'll stage it up with multiple grits as we move on. But in order to plate, there's the other side. But we got to get every bit of this plating off of there if we're going to get the new stuff to stick. So one thing here, so when you plate, any defects, any marks that are there before plating are going to be there after plating. And so one thing I did is, I bought a book on the subject, and I got some advice and some help from a forum, from the person who I signed up for my initial watch repair courses. He's got a pretty active forum. Amateurs like me, along with professionals, are on there, and one person really offered me a lot of solid advice, and so I use that. So I'm trying to apply a full polish to this case here, using some white Dialux at first on this brass, getting it pretty darn close. There we go. Then I'm going to go ahead and change it to my softest felt wheel that I have. Oh, there it is. And some red Dialux, which is really for gold and precious metals, but that's about the least abrasive compound that they make. I'm going to go ahead and just try to put a high polish on this, but I want to get this as close to as fully polished as you can possibly get it. After the polish is done, then it needs to be cleaned thoroughly. So I ran this through 2 cycles of ultrasonic in a solution that I came up with, and now we can begin the plating process. So this is right out of the ultrasonic, and you see that brass really came out. I'm sorry for the horrible footage here. I've got to figure out how to record this, but this is an electro cleaner. So after we cleaned it here, we're going to clean this. That is basically a coffee heat plate, a coffee cup warmer. I've got it set to 210, but it keeps that temperature on this particular solution at about 120 degrees. They say you can do this at room temperature, but it works better. A manufacturer set on this solution at 120 degrees. So once we apply voltage, you can see that thing foam up. It's got a stainless steel anode in it. And we're going to chemically clean this thing to get it as just as clean as possible. And then we're going to go ahead and dip this, and you can see the suds kind of falling off of it. But we're going to rinse this in distilled water. And I've got a couple rinses set up for use with each stage. But what we want to do here, there's something called a water break test when you're plating. And what it is you want to make sure that water doesn't bead up on the surface. It runs off uniformly. And if you see water droplets forming on your part, aside from water dripping off the bottom, of course, but just any water droplets, that's basically something on the surface that it's not clean enough. So you got to start over. But once it passes the water break test, now we're going to use what's called a surface activator. I run this at room temperature with a stainless steel anode, and this prepares the surface for plating so that it adheres properly. Uh, I'm running that for about 30 seconds, double checking the water break test again. And you want to make sure this thing is, they use a term called wet out. So I'm trying, you don't want to let these parts sit and dry out and all that. You want to move between the stages pretty quickly. So now I've got the anode in the nickel solution. I'm going to bring this up and I'm going to use amps on this. Here's my power supply. I did the math on this thing. In this particular case, I want about 15 to 20 microns of plating on. And so between the surface area of that and just everything you have to calculate into it, I'm at about 0.55 amps for 39 minutes. And as you can see here, I've got it in a magnetic stir. This is also up to temperature. This is about 130 degrees. Was it like 54 degrees Celsius? Stirring it to avoid bubble formations on the part. And I'll rotate this in there a few times to give equal side of the watch, time in front of that anode. And by doing amps, and by the way, you can say at the end, I finally figured out I had different camera settings. But by adjusting the amperage and not voltage, what I learned, one of the advice that guy gave me was that the flow of ions to the part remains consistent. They'll fluctuate based on your amperage. So if you just set volts and your amperage adjusts a little bit, that flow of ions will change. It may not make a bit of difference, but it does change. So I calculated everything to basically have the amps at a fixed rate because my power supply would allow me to do that, and that made sure I had an even flow of nickel ions to the part. So that's the result. I went over it just a very, very, very light with some red Dilux, and I think it cleaned up pretty nice. I had to do a little bit of cleanup on the inside of the case, again, because I can't really sand in it, all the grooves and stuff in there. So I cleaned that up. It was not difficult at all. But now we can go ahead and pop our crystal in. And I'm still waiting on parts. And that brand new crystal out of the package had dust all over it. So that was driving me crazy. So I went ahead and cleaned that up. And what I should have done is attach the crown tube before I put that crystal in, but it's not a huge deal. Here, I'm going to go ahead and press it in now. It still fit in there on the tool with the crystal in place. So there we go. And that crown tube was actually a bit of a struggle to push out. I just want to make sure I didn't form anything, that the crown fits in there. So now we can begin assembly, and we have our jewel settings. So go ahead and pop this on there and get this lubricated with some 9010. 9010 is for, lighter friction, faster moving parts. Here is the other jewel setting and my jewel that I had to order in. And I know this video is kind of moving right along, but there was about a 2-week gap. And one of the main reasons that this video took longer to bring you than is typical on the channel is because a lot of that time was spent waiting on parts to arrive. And I'm not done with parts yet. At this point in the build, there's still a part I hadn't even ordered because I didn't know I was going to need it. So I've already put in the bottom one. We're going to go ahead and put in the top jewel. I'm going to close this Inca block setting. And these are just super fantastic to do. There we go. Pop that other side in. Lovely. And I just give it the same inspections I do everything else, except for one thing. One thing. The one thing I didn't check on this thing is the one thing that gets me later. And I'll show you that. But moving on, we're going to go ahead and lubricate the barrel wall with some braking grease since this is an automatic watch. And once I get those in, I'm just going to kind of flatten those things out a little bit against that wall and just make sure that when we pop in our new mainspring, it doesn't just take that grease and push it all at the base of the barrel. So we have a brand new, white alloy mainspring, and we'll just kind of show the pushing of this in. Once I get it started, I'm trying to hold it down, and it's the kind of the outside coil you want to make sure you get a grab on. And once that thing finally snaps down into place, here in just a second, you'll see that whole thing kind of, there we go. That new spring looks beautiful. That just inner coil's right dead center. I mean, I love it. A little bit of lubrication on the inside there for the arbor. And speaking of the arbor, we can go ahead and put this thing in. And I know some of my footage in the past, it's kind of hit or miss on how good that footage is. I think I got a pretty good shot of putting this arbor in, and this one actually went in pretty nice. So, and that was a relief, because a lot of things on this watch really fought me, as we've shown and was what we'll show later. But that part there went nice. I was pretty happy about that. We can put our lid on, and we can go ahead and then pop that into place. All right, barrel done. And I'm taking a look at it underneath a microscope just to make sure that lid isn't riding high in any particular spot or anything, but it all looked good. So we can begin assembly of the watch. And I know, we are 40 minutes into this video, or 41 minutes into this video, and we're only just now, trying to put the thing together. So I'm going to, try to speed this up as much as I can, but I still want to show everything. So, yeah, I know this is a long video, so I appreciate you joining me along on this. Going to go ahead and get that plate put back down, and just to make sure that I did double check it earlier, and just make sure that, during removal that I hadn't bent it or anything, because it took so much force to remove it. And I'm going to just check in shake of this center wheel. Now we can put on that cover plate. And since we've already lubricated the wheel before we installed it, the upper pivot on that, we can just put this plate on there, because once that plate's on there, you do not have access to lubricate it. But that's just held on by one screw. Here comes our escape wheel. And I had to fiddle with this thing a little bit, and I just wanted to show it all on film, because sometimes they don't just drop into place a lot of times. And a lot of videos, most of them, I'd say most of them, 90% of them probably have more experience than I do. So they are better. But, sometimes that wheel just pops right in. But that's not always the case. At least for me. If it is for them, my hats are off to them. My hats are already off to them. I respect their abilities. But, sometimes things don't go perfect. And that's not always really reflected. So I wanted to make sure that, any problems I had, I did show you. So, but here comes the fourth wheel. We got that thing lubricated, and we'll go ahead and drop that thing down into place. And our bridge, this odd shaped bridge. And so one of the things on here that I generally try my very best to frame shots, that way you can see what's going on. But this was one of the ones where, this one here was a struggle to get all the pivots fit. And so it's the escape wheel that's causing it. So here you can still see, I'm trying to adjust that escape wheel with those locating pins. I can't really do the tapping trick on this thing. I was having difficulty with that. So what I had to basically resort to was a technique that I use when I'm not filming. And my hands are completely in the way, and my microscope's zoomed way in, but when I go that crazy high on the microscope, the camera can't really process it. So, but I got the pivot in. So, there we go. And now we get those 3 screws in there. I'll just double check free movement, and everything was good. So we can tighten everything up. So I wish I could have brought you a better shot of that, but I was at the point there that, I was like, you know what? Filming has to be secondary to this watch actually running correctly. So, I went ahead and just did it the way I did it when I don't film. But, we got that upper pivot on the fourth wheel lubricated, so we can put on our post for our oscillating weight. That's just, again, held on by 3 screws. And once we get the third one in, I'll go ahead and just tighten each one up. And again, I know we're kind of, with this camera, it really looks like I'm cranking hard on the screws, and I'm not. It's just, I think just how it looks through filming. But just take in mind, my hands do shake a little bit. So, it may look like I'm really cranking down on a screw, and I'm really not. I'm just really snugging it up to make sure it's properly tight. But now we can put on our barrel bridge. So we kind of get it oriented correctly. And this one here, there's not a whole lot to this one. So it pops on there without much issue. But again, we do have those two different sized screws to hold this bridge down. So we're going to go ahead and make sure we get the one non-shouldered screw in on the proper side. And I want to go ahead and lubricate this barrel arbor port now before I forget later. There we go. Now we can put on our click and click spring. So we're going to put the click spring in first. I just use Rodico to hold it. That way it doesn't fly out of my tweezers. We can go ahead and bring this thing into place just like that. There we go. I'm always nervous removing my tools after I do that. I keep thinking the thing's going to fly out. And I'm going to lubricate the post where the click goes. And I also want to put just a tiny, tiny bit on the edge of that spring where the nub on the underside of the click is going to engage with that. That way there's just a little dab of lubrication there. And this thing here is actually kind of a pain to align. There's a recess into the bridge plate where that little nub needs to rise. In order to do that, you got to, bring it back a little bit and put some tension on the spring. But we're not to that point yet, so I'm just going to kind of hold it right there. And I'm going to apply a little bit of oil right there because it's going to rotate with that screw head in place. But I push it back. My hands were totally in the way, but we got it pushed back. I'm just checking that the movement is free. And there we go. It looks right. So we'll go ahead and just make sure that thing is snug real quick. There we go. And just a little bit of cleanup. Now our ratchet wheel. And we just need to kind of play with the alignment of this ratchet wheel because we got to make sure that that click is engaged between two teeth. And if it's not, it'll keep that ratchet wheel from seating down fully. So I want to pull this click out of the way. There we go. And you saw that ratchet wheel just kind of fall into place. And then I bumped it and moved it back. Try number 2. There we go. And we'll go ahead and get this one screw tightened down. And in order to actually tighten it, we got to hold the ratchet wheel still. There we go. And OCD kicks in. And there we go. There's I saw a couple marks on there, but they were just marks on the part. It wasn't dust or anything. And then on the wheel train bridge where the crown wheel sits, you can see there was some marking on there where there was some wear. So we lubricated that, and we lubricated inside the crown wheel where the center is going to go. So we get that put into place. And then all that is held into place by 2 screws, which will get tightened up right here. There we go. Same thing on this one. I do that probably more than I need to, but now it's time to do the pallet fork. And I was nervous about doing this just because I remember how stubborn those bridge plates are coming off. So I just want to make sure that I was very gentle and took my time on here just to make sure that I don't want to damage anything. But the locator pins machined into the plate, or machined into the plate, and where the pallet fork kind of sits on, that is a very tight fit. So I'm very, very, very loosely doing that. But once I got that upper pivot in there and made sure it was there, I go ahead and press that plate down and it's seated down properly. And we can go ahead and tighten up our 2 screws on this. And after that's done, I want to go ahead and just put a couple winds in the watch. And I'll do that, and I'll test the locking and unlocking and make sure that power delivery to that pallet fork is looking good, and everything did. So we're going to go ahead and apply just the tiniest bit of Mobius 9415, which is a special lubricant for this escapement. You can kind of see it applying it to the teeth on that escape wheel. Pretty decent shot of it there. So apply that and repeat that process 2 more times. And now we can put in our balance. So when we install the balance, what I'm doing is seeing the orientation that the pallet fork is in which way the impulse jewel needs to engage with it. So that's why you see the balance kind of go in at a weird angle and they get turned into the right way instead of just dropping straight down. But we got that in there and the thing fired up. And at first glance, I was like, wow, all right, cool. This thing's happy and running and all that. Although, the first thing I look at is the kind of oscillation of that thing and looking at its amplitude. And it honestly didn't look that great, but I just put it in. But while that thing begins to run, I'm going to go ahead and lubricate the wheel train. So we'll lubricate the third wheel and the escape wheel on the rear side, and then on the underside, lubricate everything but the barrel arbor because I did lubricate it, but it was off camera. As you can see my notes below, my camera died right at the very end, so it didn't show me lubricating that, but I got that done. And then I'll let this thing run in for about 30 to 40 minutes before I put it on the time grapher. And when I did, the results were not good. Not good. Amplitude was like 160 and it was all over the place. The trace lines were awful. As it turns out, I had basically 0 in shake, and it's the one thing I didn't check. So I had to, you can see here as I was removing the, disassembling the balance, I bent the hairspring. Thankfully, as far as hairspring repairs go, this is probably the absolute easiest thing to repair. None of it's easy. This is the easiest. This is basically nothing. This almost doesn't even count as hairspring, repaired because, yeah, I got lucky if that's all that was wrong with it. So I'll do that. But in order to check in shake, so the setting on the main plate for the balance is screwed into the main plate. So you can't adjust that. You can't adjust the setting in the balance cock because it's held on by this clip so that you can't really press it. So the only way to adjust it would have been to use a shim, which I really don't want to do. So what I ended up doing was getting a replacement balance cock and reassembling the balance. You can see the mark I put there with that arrow to indicate the position of the stud before I removed it. So we'll go ahead and get that pressed back on, in place and then pressed back on. And I'm just going to take a look at it here afterwards. And the hairspring looks flat. No major issues. That stud is now at 90 degrees like it should be. And I'm going to go ahead and just put it on the bench block here and just take one more check and make sure all the coils in that hairspring look correct. And, nothing's out of whack. I've cleaned this thing thoroughly a bunch. So I've got a different balance cock here. And as you can see, one thing I didn't even consider when I ordered it was the plating because the part number was correct. But this one here has a different, it's like a gold colored plating. It's the right part though. So I'm going with it. But we'll go ahead and get this thing in. And that there took, again, it was a delay getting that part in. But it turns out there was probably a slight bend in that original balance cock. So I've got this thing here overbanked at the moment. So I'm going to lift this up and lift that impulse jewel over the pallet fork and let it engage from the other side. And then there we go. Now that thing is fired up and running. So we'll give this thing a shot. And the reason I didn't have time grapher results on the first one is because as soon as I put it on there, I saw the problem and I immediately started investigating. So I'm sorry I didn't bring you that footage. And we're not done with it yet. So here's the footage with just that repair done. It's been running about an hour. And that's it. And although it's running and it fixed our snowstorm issue and all that, our amplitude is not where it needs to be. Truth be told, you could put this watch on your wrist, you could set the rate, and it would probably run and keep time fine. But there is clearly a power loss happening somewhere in this watch that at this point, I was convinced that it wasn't in the balance. And so I started checking pivots, everything, and double checked everything. And one thing we'll go back to the barrel. The one thing I didn't check on the barrel is what got me. So I ordered a replacement barrel, and because the barrel lid, there's the old one on the left, the replacement on the right, same plating. Oddly enough, I didn't buy a donor ribbon, I bought parts, but I got the same plating on that. The barrel lid was the hole for the arbor port on the barrel lid was basically egg shaped. worn out, and I guess you could rebush those. I wasn't comfortable doing that. There's not a lot of meat there on that lid, so I got a replacement barrel. And here we go. Amplitude's where it needs to be. I haven't really dialed in any regulation yet, but this we can absolutely work with. We found where our power loss was coming from. So amplitude 270s ish, bumped into the 280s a little bit. So yeah, we'll go ahead and that's all done. So we can start assembly of the front side of the movement. And so I'm going to go ahead and get this setting lever in. And I noticed that you saw I didn't have the thing screwed down properly. So you probably saw that as I was putting in the setting lever. I learned that lesson pretty quick. Go ahead and flip this thing over and make sure it's actually tight. And now with that Rodico holding that setting lever in place, we can go ahead and tighten that screw down. And that'll secure that part. Flip this back over and make sure it's actually tight in the holder, Adam. And there we go. So here we're going to go ahead and apply some grease to the winding pinion and sliding clutch. Honestly, it's a bit more grease than is needed. I mean, you need a good amount of grease. Is a real high friction point. I kind of overdid it. I'll clean up the excess though in the watch before we're done though. So you do want a good amount of grease there again, but I mean, that's probably overkill what I did. So we get those two parts put into place. There we go. There goes our sliding clutch. And we need to apply a bit more grease on the sliding clutch. We're in that channel where the yoke is going to sit. So putting it on the inside walls of that yoke, and that's where that yoke is going to engage when it moves that sliding clutch back and forth. And a little bit on the post there for the yoke itself, and a bit more grease on the edge of that setting lever where the edge of the yoke is going to engage with that side. As you pull the crown in and out, the tip of that setting lever is what moves that yoke back and forth, thus subsequently moving the sliding clutch back and forth. Here's our yoke spring. And this is an on spring. It kind of fits into a little recess in the back. And I got to, there we go. Find the right spot to hold my tool because I got to lift that spring over that post. There we go. And then bring it down into place. If I can manage to do it. There we go. And then also want to apply a bit more grease. I probably could have, it would have been easier to put it on the yoke before I put the spring on, but we'll go ahead and apply a little bit of grease here. And just clean up the excess once we're done. Making sure that that spring doesn't fly out when I pull my tools out. There we go. We'll clean up the excess grease. And we can put on our setting lever spring. So we'll go ahead and just get the screw in, but not all the way down. But I just want it there so it'll hold the part, and I can go ahead and put some grease into these two slots because there's two positions for this crown. So there's two notches in there, and we're going to go ahead and grease those and then set that hook onto the setting lever. There we go. And now with that done, we can fully tighten down the setting lever spring. Next up, I want to install the stem. So I'm going to just loosen that screw, but not completely remove it. Otherwise the setting lever will become disconnected. But with that done, we'll go ahead and just apply some lubrication to the stem on all four of those flats where it's going to ride inside that sliding clutch and then on the tip. Now we can push that into place. And with that screw loosened on that setting lever, it'll allow that to go in. Then we just tighten that screw back up and it'll clamp down on that and then hold that stem into place. And there we go. So just double checking everything, making sure that it feels good. I'm working that grease on the setting lever spring just to make sure that it's kind of evenly distributed and where it needs to be. And then we can go through and just clean up the excess on everything. Because really what I'm looking for is just a kind of a light, just a film of grease on the inside of that setting lever spring and on that post and all that stuff. And I don't want the globs of it on there that, I put on there, but it allows me to get it where it needs to be and clean up the excess in the end. So this here is the jumper for the date wheel. We're going to go ahead and screw this down. And again, make note of that screw because it's going to be a problem later. And now we need to adjust the cannon pinion. So you can see that dimple on that, that's factory, and that's how they set the tension on that. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm using the micrometer, so that thing actually is moving slightly. I've got a stop on a micrometer on this Sights jeweling tool, so I'm just using that so I don't overdo it. And I've got a smoothing broach inside of it to make sure I don't crush the thing. And that's purely a feel thing. So and luckily I've done that a few times, and I kind of by feel I kind of know in what, how much I want to go in each stage. You can overdo it and then bring it back with a smoothing broach, but here, take a listen. It felt good. It sounded good. And thankfully I didn't have to adjust it more than once, but you really can't test it until, you get the rest of these parts installed. But that's how we tighten up the cannon pinion. And now I'm just applying some lubrication to the rest of the parts, the minute wheel, the calendar driving wheel, and then the intermediate calendar driving wheel. And then on the outside of the cannon pinion for the hour wheel, we lubricated that post a bit earlier. I didn't say it, but we did. There we go. There's the minute wheel. Just making sure that engages the teeth with both the cannon pinion, or with the cannon pinion and that intermediate wheel. There it goes. It kind of sat down into place. There's the driving wheel for that date ring. And you can see that little post on there. That little post that sticks up on that is what moves it. But so you have to orient these two wheels and make sure that that little nub on the intermediate wheel is kind of in between. So as you turn it around, it kind of fits in there. So that wheel will turn 4 times for every one time it actually engages with that date wheel. Now we can put on our hour wheel. And with that, I'm just going to kind of give everything a test. And if you watch that calendar driving wheel, you can see there, and that's where that post would have moved that date wheel around. So now we can install that. And so this thing here, that usually, there's usually a ring kind of machined into the plate where that wheel kind of sits up against. And it was very shallow on this thing. So when I was looking at it when I was removing it, I was like, there's not a lot holding that on before you get the cover plate on it. So I'm kind of coming at it from the side, engaging that spring, and then just kind of moving that wheel into place. And that seemed to be a really easy way of attaching that. But now we can put on our cover plate. So there's 2 indexing pins on the underside of that cover plate. We're going to find their home here, and then that plate will sit down. There it goes. And then we can attach the 2 screws holding that plate into place. And lastly, I'm just going to apply a little bit of lubrication to that jumper spring where it's going to engage with the teeth on that date wheel. And just kind of make things run, just move it just a hair a bit more smoothly. Just double checking as it turns over and just going real slow. Yeah, that seemed to work okay. Move the date over without much issue. It felt pretty good. So now back on the other side of the movement, we can install the automatic winding works. So the first wheel we're going to do here is the transmission wheel, and we lubricated the bottom pivot of that already. And so that's going to engage with the crown wheel that will subsequently engage with the ratchet wheel and wind the watch. This here is the reduction wheel. And that's, honestly, that's probably, and that may even not be what they call it. That's what I've called it because that's what Seiko calls a lot of their stuff. And I've almost got half the Seiko manuals memorized, but it performs the same function. The manual for this movement is in French. And so I haven't gone so far as to, and I do not speak French, so I haven't gone so far as to translate what they call it. But if they do not call it a reduction wheel or transmission wheel, it serves the exact same function. So we're going to get this click put into place and get the spring in, and try not to breathe as I put it in because I don't want this thing to fly off before we put our cover plate on. And to my surprise, that actually went on without too much fuss. We'll go ahead and pull that spring back. There we go. My hand's in the way, but the spring was a little bit too far forward, but there we go. And lastly is this little gear that the oscillating weight engages with. That gear will turn the reduction wheel. There we go. Now there's 4 pivots, just on this little thing we got to get this bridge on. And this is the other one that was just ridiculous. This one was super tight. And so getting that click put into place, I've got some footage here, and it's honestly not the greatest because when I've got the lights on the microscope, I can see it beautifully through the eyepiece, but the camera is kind of washed out. But the click, and the click had kind of fallen underneath that reduction wheel, so I'm bringing it back up. There we go. But the pivot is not in the bushing yet. So I'm just kind of working it around a little bit, trying to get that pivot into place. And when I finally do, you'll see it drop down, just boom, right there. Now it went in. Now I can I double check everything else, make sure it's there, and then I can press that plate down. So I wish the quality could be better. I may just have to spend some money on a quality camera for that microscope because it'll capture things that the regular cameras don't. But I mean, it's just a cheap Amazon, camera, because I didn't really know if I was gonna, record videos or whatever. I mainly just bought it to take pictures when I was doing this before I uploaded videos, and it works great for that. But I mean, if I want to use a much more of the microscope footage, I probably should invest in a better camera with a better lens, with adjustable aperture and all that. So here, we're going to go ahead and get the dial put on, and the keen eyes among you may have already spotted the problem, but we'll get into that here in just a second. We go ahead and press on our hour hand. There we go. And here we go. Well, we'll show you. Take a look at the date window. The date wheel is not aligned properly in the date window, and it's that screw we referenced earlier. That screw, along with the two screws for the cover plate, are both countersunk screws, and the shoulders, the tapered cut on the underside of the screw is slightly different. So I put the wrong screw in there, and because of that, it aligned kind of that spring a little bit off. So I didn't catch it. At this point here, I didn't even see it. But magically at the end of the video, when you see that date wheel and it's aligned properly, it's because I figured that out and went back and swapped those screws. So just checking the alignment of the hands here real quick, just to make sure nothing's rubbing. We have clearance over the applied indices, the Tissot logo, all that looks really good. So now we can go ahead and put our seconds hand on, and I'm just with a whisper. And like I said, I'll quote Bob Ross, 2 hairs and some air. That's all the pressure I'm using right there, just to kind of get it on there. And once it is, I'll move it over here and press it into place. And this doesn't take much pressure at all, but there we go. And I'll just double check alignment one more time to make sure everything's clearing. But you can see there as we case up this movement, which I love this watch, I'll tell you. Yeah, that date window though, I do catch it later and I do fix it, but at the end of the video, you'll see it's corrected. But I want to make sure I had to put it somewhere in the video to show you why, because when I saw it, I fixed it and then I forgot to hit record. And I was like, I got to figure out how to show them that. So we got the crown in, with it in, and lesson learned, it probably would have been easier not to have the crown in its full inward position, but we'll put this ring in, and it's got to straddle that crown tube, and it's it's not loose, but it's kind of a semi-tight fit. But I just kind of had to work it around a little bit, but there we go. And that is directional. There's a beveled cut to that allows you to put in those case clamps. So I had to make sure that movement ring in was in the proper orientation, but now we can put our case clamps back into place. And when we screw those in, you can see it catches a lip on the underside of the case. It'll pull that movement back a little bit. So there we go. We'll get our second one in. There it is. And it'll lift that up. And as it moves that side, that other side may have a little bit more adjustment left in it. So I'm just double checking it, and sure enough, it did. Once the movement became level in the case, and I just kind of tightened those both again just to make sure they were good. And now we can put on our oscillating weight. So I'm lubricating that post we installed quite a long time ago. And I'm also lubricating the wheel assembly on the underside of this thing, just to make sure that we don't forget that. It's probably an easy thing to forget at this point because you're so close to the end. And now you got to make sure that it's in the proper orientation. That way it can straddle that gear that we installed. but when it goes in, it'll kind of straddle that, and there we go. Just kind of giving it a quick test. Now we can put on that clip. There we go. Yep, there we go. And when we get it all the way where it slides down in there, then we can just push it back into place and it'll hold that winding weight down. Perfect. Then I'll just rotate it around a few times and make sure that it's not catching anything, and that I'm also looking at the ratchet wheel or the crown wheel and just making sure that regardless of which way I turn that oscillating weight, that it's turning those parts in one direction. All that seems to be working just great. So now I sourced a new gasket for the case back, which was not easy to do. It's an odd shape, but I found one, and we can go ahead and just press on this case back. And that kind of it gave a click. I heard it snap in, but I just want to rotate it around a little bit and just make sure if there's any more movement in it that I got it pressed in. There we go. And now we can take a look at this watch, and just kind of wanted you to see it at this point here before we did it. And it's just an honest showing of how the plating turned out. I'm actually pretty pleased with it. There's things that I can improve on. I did a little bit of work on the case back. I didn't go full polish on the edge. That's 2000 grit paper. But then when I got to that point, I was like, man, I kind of like the look of that. And I didn't want to go full mirror polish on it. So I kept it there. And then I'll speed up the footage here because I was moving ridiculously slow, trying to show it in front of the camera. But this is kind of how it turned out. And I'm really pleased with it. I think with that case and, looking like it does, but with the dial and the hands untouched, I don't know what it is. I just like it. So we'll go ahead and put this strap on and take a notice here, and you can see the lugs on the side. You see how they're drilled, so you can access the spring bar from the outside, which is handy to have, mind you. I didn't even notice this at first until I watched the video later. So when we flip this watch around, take a look at this side. They're not drilled. So they've only drilled one side of that. Maybe that's common. I don't know. I've never really seen that before. But ladies and gentlemen, here's the finished watch. This thing was a challenge. It was more of a challenge than I anticipated it to be. It delayed the release of the video by quite a while, but I'm really happy with how it turned out. I'm really proud of it. I learned a lot of stuff along the way. So folks, if you enjoyed the video, I really would appreciate it if you like and subscribed if you haven't already. It really does help the channel grow. And thank you so much for stopping by. I sure hope to see you again on a future video. I'm about to start working on the next one, and we'll see you soon. Take care.